So let me first take away the most important issue, which is why am I dressed so fashionably. That's because my luggage didn't arrive.
And you were twittering about it, but there was no solution, I guess.
There is a solution. It actually made it to the airport, and it's there for me to pick up later.
In Athens?
In Athens.
Okay, good luck.
I know. Okay, so I'm going to not speak so much about how dangerous populism is. I'm going to take away some of the points that have been made earlier, previous sessions, and just now. And so when we want to talk about populism, as populism, we have to focus on the essence. And the essence of populism is the struggle between the so-called the people and the elite. Nativism, which is the struggle between the own people and the others, the aliens, is not an essential part of populism, even though quite a lot of populist parties combine it. But certain parties do not. Think about Syriza here, or left-wing populists in Latin America. I think that while populism is relevant and adds to our understanding of contemporary politics, it is significantly exaggerated in terms of its importance and its power. The Trump election was not a victory of populism. 89% of self-described Republicans voted for Trump, which meant Republicans voted for Republicans, as they have been doing over the last decades in an increasingly polarized country. The vast majority of these people would have voted for Rubio, who is not a populist, and have voted before for Bush, who wasn't a populist. Brexit, again, was not a populist vote. The majority of the voters came from the Conservative Party, the elitist party par excellence. It's not to say that populism didn't play an important role in it. It pushed it over the 50%. Without the UKIP part of it, which was more nativist and populist, it would not have made it. But without the conservative backing, it also wouldn't have made it. Right? And so it's important to keep that in mind. Yesterday, we were told by a journalist of The People that the people vote for populists, and that the people don't like Europe, and the people this and the people that. The fact of the matter is that on average, roughly 16% of the population votes for populist parties within the EU. Now, if you extend that a little bit broader and include some extremist parties and some other parties that we consider to be outside of the mainstream, and we ballpark it very high, that would be 1/4 of the vote that is like the anti-vote. That means 75% does not vote for it. 75% vote for parties that are by and large still perceived as the mainstream. And I think the reason why we have the perception of crisis has much more to do with the 75% than with the 25%. The reason why the populists are perceived as the voice of the people, mostly by the media, but increasingly by mainstream politicians too, is because mainstream politicians don't have much of a story. Social Democrats lost their story already in the 1990s, and much of the Christian Democrats, as well as conservative, have lost their story in the early 21st century. And I think the so-called refugee crisis is a very good example of where that came out to play, where there was really only one voice, which was, we call it the voice of the populist, but it was really a nativist argument. The argument was not first and foremost about the elite failing, it was first and foremost about the aliens coming into our country. As soon as the established parties solved it in the eyes of the media as well as the people, most of the people, or a sizable portion of the people, left the radical right populist again. A very good example is Austria, where Sebastian Kurz, who was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, was crucial in closing off the Balkan route, and then sold that in the elections and said, look, I'm also concerned about the foreigners coming in, but I've taken care of this, so you don't need the FPÖ anymore. And he pretty much took 10% of the FPÖ and took it over. In the Netherlands, my own prime minister pretty much won his campaign, Mark Rutte, by pandering to the electorate of the radical right. Not so much by populists. You didn't hear Rutte speak about the evil elite, purely on nativism. It was about the Muslims. Now, this is not to say that populism isn't relevant. Like, there is an important part to the fact that today, nativism, a xenophobic form of nationalism, is primarily presented through a populist lens. In the early 20th century, it was primarily presented through an extremist sense. It was through fascism, which was anti-democratic. Populism is not so much anti-democratic, it's anti-liberal democratic. It supports popular sovereignty and majority rule. It has problems with protections of minorities, with freedom of speech, with rule of law. Like, that's an important shift. And to a certain extent, as Walter Russell Mead said, this has to do with culture. And I think that this is the part that we need to look at more, is this idea that the people, right, which of course is only a small part of the actual population, believes that the elite, the political caste, the political establishment, has a different culture than they have. Right? The question is that new? And I don't think so, because actually particularly West European politics was deeply paternalistic for the whole 20th century. Christian Democrats, conservatives, social democrats, none of them trusted the people. What has different and what has changed is the people. The population has become more self-confident, has become better educated, and accepts less of the establishment. To a certain extent, is thereby pandered to by politicians who increasingly tell the voters that they never make the mistake. And so the relationship between the establishment and the population has changed. But the biggest change is not so much in the dysfunction of the establishment, which has always been reasonably dysfunctional. They just haven't been held to the same standards as they're held today. And this is something that's structural, and we'll have to come to terms with it. Because if we, and with we, I mean both the media, politicians, and voters, right, don't come to terms with the new reality in which voters feel that they are equally competent to judge politics as politicians, we're going to keep going into this frustrating dilemma where we by and large absolve the people from every decision and increasingly no longer lead but follow a population which obviously is diverse and doesn't know where it's going.